What if I told you that the most brutal stories of Brazil's desert bandits, the Cangaceiros, are not the ones you've been taught in history class? What if their actions weren't simply those of criminals, but part of a larger, chilling strategy? You see, the Cangaceiros weren't just about robbing and killing, they were about terrorizing, breaking spirits, and leaving scars that went far beyond the physical. The Cangaceiros, like Lampião, Maria Bonita, Ancorisco, are legendary figures. But while many admire them for their daring exploits, few truly understand the depths of their cruelty. The stories we know are only fragments of a much darker reality, one that history has carefully swept under the rug. What they did to captured soldiers was far worse than what you might imagine, and more calculated than most historians are willing to admit. But what made these bandits so terrifying wasn't just their ability to kill. No, it was the psychological warfare they waged. They didn't just raid villages or attack armies. They aimed to break their enemies mentally, to leave them so terrified that they'd never think to resist again. The question isn't just how did they fight, it's why were they so effective at making people fear them? As we explore this dark chapter of Brazilian history, you'll uncover the twisted tactics that turned the Cangaceiros into masters of psychological terror, and why their cruelty still haunts the collective memory of the people of the Brazilian Northeast. Do you think you know the real story of the Cangaceiros? Think again. Drop a comment below and share what you've heard about Lampião and his band of outlaws. If you think history has hidden more than we realize, hit the like button. And don't forget to check if you're subscribed, because you won't want to miss what's coming next. What drove the Cangaceiros to inflict such horror on those they captured? The truth is, their violence wasn't random, it was systematic, strategic, and psychologically calculated. These weren't just bandits running wild in the desert. They were ruthless tacticians who understood the power of fear. Lampião, the most notorious of them all, didn't just want to terrorize, he wanted to dominate. And he did so with a cold, calculated precision that most would never expect from a group of outlaws. From the very beginning, the Cangaceiros understood something that many soldiers and rulers never did. Terror can be more effective than a bullet. Every raid, every ambush, every brutal punishment inflicted on a prisoner was meant to send a clear message. It wasn't just about killing or stealing, it was about breaking the enemy, about showing them that resistance wasn't just futile, it was a death sentence, both for their bodies and their spirits. One of the most chilling aspects of the Cangaço wasn't just the physical torture they inflicted on captured soldiers. It was how they manipulated fear. By targeting the military and civilian populations, with violence that seemed unprovoked, they created an atmosphere of constant tension and dread. Soldiers who had fought in wars and seen countless deaths feared these outlaws in a way that few could understand. What made the Cangaceiros so terrifying wasn't just their strength, but the way they used terror as a weapon to strip people of their will to resist. This wasn't just about control, it was about the psychological manipulation of entire regions. Imagine walking into a town and knowing that at any moment a group of Cangaceiros could strike. Imagine the constant weight on your shoulders, knowing that even a small mistake could lead to the most horrific of punishments. This was the daily life of the people in the Northeast. But for the Cangaceiros, it was just part of the plan. They knew that the true power wasn't in the fight, it was in the ability to make the enemy surrender without ever lifting a sword. As we dive deeper into the mind of these desert bandits, we'll uncover the twisted brilliance behind their tactics, how they turned fear into an art form, and why their brutality wasn't just about bloodshed, it was about control, domination, and the absolute destruction of resistance. Lampião wasn't just a bandit. He was a master strategist, and his campaigns were as much about psychological warfare as they were about physical confrontations. Known as the King of Cangaço, Lampião led his band with an iron fist, and his tactics were designed to do more than just intimidate. They were designed to crush the morale of entire armies and make entire towns surrender without a single shot fired. One of the most effective aspects of Lampião's strategy was his use of surprise and mobility. The Cangaceiros were experts at guerrilla warfare. They would strike fast and then disappear into the deserts and hills of the Northeast, leaving their enemies with no time to react. This hit-and-run tactic made it nearly impossible to catch them. It also made the Cangaceiros seem invincible. Soldiers who thought they could outsmart Lampião's band were constantly left with their guard down, blindsided by a sudden ambush. But it wasn't just about speed and surprise, it was about the message that every raid sent. Lampião knew that his greatest weapon wasn't just his minute, was the terror he instilled in the hearts of those who would cross his path. When his forces descended upon a town, they didn't just loot, they created chaos, left destruction in their wake, and reminded everyone that even the law couldn't protect them from the Cangaceiros. Every time Lampião's band attacked, it was more than just a raid, it was a demonstration of power. It wasn't uncommon for captured soldiers to be subjected to cruel public executions, where the Cangaceiros would make an example of them to send a message to any would-be resistance. This terror didn't just stay with the soldiers, it reached into the lives of the civilians who, knowing the Cangaceiros' brutality, often surrendered their support to avoid being caught in the crossfire. Lampião didn't need to win every battle. He knew that fear itself could win the war. But it wasn't just the violence that made Lampião so feared, it was the precision with which he conducted these operations. Each raid was calculated down to the smallest detail. His men knew when to strike, where to hide, and when to retreat. They operated with military precision, which allowed them to sustain their campaigns for years, despite being vastly outnumbered. In this chapter, we will uncover how Lampião's calculated terror campaigns left a deep mark on the history of Brazil. By exploring his tactical genius, we'll understand why his influence over the region lasted far beyond his death. He didn't just fight for survival, he fought to rewrite the rules of power in the Brazilian backlands, using fear as his most effective weapon. While Lampião is often remembered as the face of the Cangaço, his partner Maria Bonita played a crucial role in shaping the movement. Maria Bonita wasn't just the wife of a notorious bandit, she was a fierce, determined woman who embodied the spirit of resistance and survival. Her involvement in the Cangaceiros wasn't a passive one. She was as much a force to be reckoned with as the men who rode alongside her. At a time when women were expected to adhere to rigid social norms, Maria Bonita defied all expectations. She took up arms, fought in battles, and participated in the violent raids led by Lampião. But her role wasn't just about fighting, it was about defying the gender norms of the time and asserting her place in a world dominated by men. In the harsh, unforgiving environment of the back, survival depended not only on strength but on the ability to outthink and outlast the enemy. Maria Bonita, alongside Lampião, understood this better than anyone. Maria's story is particularly significant because it challenges the traditional narrative of women. During the time in the Cangaço, women weren't just bystanders, they were warriors in their own right. Maria Bonita, in particular, represented a shift in the role of women within the Cangaceiro movement. She was known for her bravery, her loyalty to her band, and her cunning. In fact, she was often seen as a symbol of power, not only because of her relationship with Lampião, but because of her ability to lead and survive in a violent, male-dominated world. Her involvement in the Cangaço also helped solidify the idea of the Cangaceiro band as a family and extended family that operated on its own terms, where women held a place of power equal to that of the men. Maria Bonita's story, though often overshadowed by her husband's, is one of survival, resistance, and the assertion of agency in a time and place where both were in short supply. But Maria Bonita's story isn't just one of defiance, it's also a story of deep tragedy. Her eventual capture and death marked the end of a chapter in the Cangaço era, but it also symbolized the loss of a powerful symbol of female resilience. Her legacy, however, lives on as a testament to the role of women in the Cangaço and in shaping the very narrative of resistance against oppression in Brazil. Cangaço, often referred to as the devil of the Cangaço, was a figure whose brutality exceeded even that of his fellow bandits. His name became synonymous with terror, and his methods of dealing with captured soldiers and enemies were so cruel that they left an indelible mark on the history of the Cangaceiros. While Lampião was the charismatic leader, Cangaço was the embodiment of pure rage and sadistic power man, whose methods of torture and execution were as legendary as his ruthless efficiency. Corisco's reputation for cruelty spread far beyond the deserts and hills of the Brazilian back. His attacks were often marked by extreme violence and public displays of power. But what set Corisco apart was the sheer sadism with which he carried out his punishments. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Corisco didn't just kill his enemies. He went further, creating rituals of terror that would haunt the minds of those who were unlucky enough to witness them. One of the most terrifying aspects of Corisco's methods was his penchant for torturing prisoners before killing them. For Corisco, the torture was as much a psychological weapon as it was a physical one. The pain inflicted wasn't just meant to bring an end to life, it was meant to send a message to anyone who thought of resisting the Cangaço. His victims were often forced to endure agonizing suffering, not just as punishment, but as a way of instilling fear in others. Some of the tales of Corisco's brutality are almost too horrific to believe. He would sometimes subject prisoners to prolonged periods of suffering before executing them, prolonging their agony in order to make an example out of them. The Cangaceiro didn't just want obedience, he wanted absolute submission, and he was willing to break his victims in every possible way. This sadistic nature turned Corisco into a figure of pure terror, not only for his enemies, but also for those who served under him. His reputation for cruelty was further cemented by his tendency to execute traitors and informants in front of the rest of his band. These executions were not quick and clean. Instead, they were drawn out, often involving public humiliation and torture. Corisco believed that if he could break his enemies in the most painful way possible, he would send a message to anyone who might think of betraying the Cangaceiros. But Corisco's cruelty was not just limited to his enemies. His relationship with his own men was one of strict control, where fear of his violent reprisals kept everyone in line. He ruled through fear, and it was this control over the minds of his followers that made him such a dangerous figure. It wasn't just about the bloodshed, it was about making everyone understand that to defy him was to embrace certain death. Corisco's reputation as the devil of the Cangaço is a testament to the fear he instilled in those around him. His methods were so extreme, so deliberate, that they have become etched into the memory of the Brazilian people. His brutal tactics ensured that even after his death, the name Corisco would remain a symbol of terror, and his legacy would continue to haunt the history of the Cangaceiros. The Cangaceiros were not simply criminals, they were masters of cruelty, and their torture rituals were designed to break more than just the body. These rituals were not just about death. They were psychological weapons, meticulously crafted to instill fear and send a chilling message to anyone who dared to defy them. The stories of the Cangaceiros' brutality are legendary, but the true extent of their torturous methods is far darker than most history books reveal. The primary objective of the Cangaceiros' torture rituals was to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. Captured soldiers and informants were not simply executed. They were made to suffer in ways that were designed to break their spirit before taking their lives. The Cangaceiros understood that the real power didn't lie in the number of victims, but in the psychological torment they inflicted. One of the most common torture methods employed by the Cangaceiros was the slow and agonizing process of dismemberment. Prisoners would be tied up, and their limbs would be severed in a slow, painful manner, leaving them to die slowly. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about creating a spectacle that left everyone who witnessed it paralyzed with fear. The Cangaceiros knew that the more painful and drawn out the torture, the stronger the message would be. But the Cangaceiros' cruelty didn't stop at physical torture. There were psychological tactics at play as well. One of the most terrifying elements of the Cangaceiros' torture rituals was their ability to manipulate the minds of their captives. They would often force their victims to witness the execution or torture of their comrades before finally putting them to death. This made the ordeal even more unbearable, as it stripped away any hope of survival and left the prisoners helpless, their minds consumed by the horror they had just witnessed. The Cangaceiros would also often take great pleasure in humiliating their captives, making them beg for mercy or perform degrading acts before finally ending their lives. These torturous acts were not just meant to punish, they were designed to break the human spirit. The Cangaceiros were experts in mental warfare, using fear and humiliation as tools to keep both their enemies and their followers in check. What makes these torture rituals even more chilling is the fact that they were carried out with methodical precision. the Cangaceiros didn't act out of pure rage or madness. Everything they did was calculated down to the smallest detail. They understood the power of fear, and they wielded it like a weapon. Their torture rituals were not random. They were part of a larger strategy to assert their dominance and control over everyone around them. The Cangaceiros' torture tactics were so effective that they became ingrained in the culture of fear in the Brazilian Northeast. Entire towns and villages lived in constant terror, knowing that the Cangaceiros could strike at any moment, and that no one soldier, civilian, or informant was safe from their cruelty. Even the smallest infraction, even the slightest sign of resistance, could lead to a brutal death. In this chapter, we will explore the horrific rituals of torture employed by the Cangaceiros and examine the psychological tactics they used to ensure that their reign of terror would be remembered for generations to come. These rituals were not just acts of violence, they were acts of control, meant to dismantle the will of those who crossed paths with the Cangaceiros. The Cangaceiros didn't just rule the desert, they dominated the hearts and minds of entire regions, turning fear into their most effective weapon. Their raids weren't just about stealing goods or killing soldiers, they were calculated performances of terror, meant to instill such deep-rooted fear in the population that resistance was rendered utterly hopeless. The public display of power was one of the most terrifying elements of the Cangaço, and it was executed with chilling precision. When the Cangaceiros descended upon a town, they didn't just strike and retreat. No, they made sure their presence was known, ensuring that every man, woman, and child in the vicinity felt the weight of their terror. Lampião, the leader of the Cangaceiros, understood that fear could be more effective than any army. He knew that by creating a spectacle, he could make an entire community submit without lifting a sword. One of the key tactics the Cangaceiros used to instill fear was public executions. When they captured soldiers or traitors, they didn't simply kill them in secret. No, they made sure their executions were witnessed by as many people as possible. The Cangaceiros would often perform these executions in the town square or other public areas, forcing the people to watch the gruesome spectacle unfold. The idea was simple. If the people saw what happened to those who resisted or betrayed them, they would be too terrified to ever challenge the themselves. But the executions weren't just meant to punish, they were meant to break the spirits of the people. The Cangaceiros would make sure the executions were as brutal and drawn out as possible, allowing the victims to suffer in front of the crowd. This wasn't just about killing, it was about sending a message. The Cangaceiros wanted to show the population that defiance was futile and that resistance would be met with unimaginable consequences. Even the soldiers who tried to fight back weren't spared the Cangaceiros' cruelty. Captured soldiers were often paraded through the streets like trophies, their bodies beaten and bruised, and then executed in front of the terrified townspeople. These public displays of violence weren't just about sending a message to the enemies of the Cangaceiros, they were about ensuring that the civilians knew their place in the power hierarchy. The Cangaceiros were not only fighting the military, they were fighting the very fabric of Brazilian society, and they were making sure that no one would forget who ruled the land. The Cangaceiros' ability to stage these public performances of terror was not just about physical violence, it was a psychological tactic designed to make entire communities comply. When the people saw their own soldiers humiliated, tortured, and executed in front of their eyes, they knew that the Cangaceiros were untouchable. This left the population with only two options: submission or death. And the Cangaceiros knew how to exploit that fear, manipulating the population with brutal efficiency. What made these public displays of power even more terrifying was the fact that they were carried out with a sense of ritual. The Cangaceiros didn't just execute their victims at random, they made sure that their displays of violence were meticulously planned. They knew when to strike, where to strike, and how to make the greatest impact. Every execution, every raid, was part of a larger strategy to crush the spirit of resistance and make the Cangaceiros appear invincible. As we continue to explore the legacy of the Cangaceiros, we'll see how their terrifying displays of power left deep psychological scars on the people they ruled. Their ability to control the minds of their enemies and even their own followers was what truly made them formidable. They didn't just rely on brute force, they relied on fear, and it worked, while the Cangaceiros, led by figures like Lampião and Maria Bonita, are often remembered for their audacity, their brutal tactics, and their ability to terrorize entire regions. The untold stories of the countless victims they left in their wake are often overlooked. The Cangaceiros didn't just harm soldiers and wealthy landowners, they affected entire communities, and many of their victims remain forgotten by history. These stories, though rarely told, are crucial to understanding the full impact of the true scale of the Cangaceiros' terror can be seen not only through their battles, but also through the lives they've destroyed without a second thought. For the peasants and civilians caught in the Cangaceiros' path, the experience wasn't just one of fear, it was one of relentless suffering. Whole families were forced to flee their homes, and entire villages were abandoned or wiped off the map entirely. The Cangaceiros didn't just take lives, they took livelihoods, homes, and hope. The victims of the Cangaceiros weren't always the ones who fought against them. Often, they were innocent civilians who had no part in the conflict but found themselves caught in the middle. Women, children, and the elderly were forced to watch as their villages were raided, their homes burned, and their families murdered or tortured. These innocent people weren't just casualties of war, they were victims of a band of ruthless outlaws who showed no mercy to anyone in their path. But beyond the physical destruction, the emotional and psychological toll of the Cangaço was even more profound. Survivors of these raids often lived with the trauma for the rest of their lives. The fear instilled by the Cangaceiros was not only from the violence itself, but from the knowledge that anyone could be targeted at any time. Whether they were civilians, soldiers, or even fellow bandits, no one was ever truly safe from the wrath of the Cangaceiros. The forgotten victims of the Cangaço were often left with nothing but scars, physical, mental, and emotional. In many cases, these victims were left to rebuild their lives with little to no help or support from the government. The stories of these people were rarely documented or acknowledged, and many of them disappeared into obscurity as the years passed. Their lives and their suffering became little more than footnotes in the broader story of the Congo. However, the impact of the Cangaceiros' reign of terror can still be seen in the region today. The legacy of fear and violence they left behind continues to shape the collective memory of the people of the Northeast. While many have forgotten the victims, the echoes of their suffering remain in the stories that have been passed down through generations. These stories may have been forgotten by history, but they are far from gone. By shedding light on the untold stories of these forgotten victims, we gain a deeper understanding of the true cost of the Cangaço. It wasn't just about the notorious bandits who stole the spotlight, it was about the countless innocent lives that were shattered by their violence. And it's these untold stories, hidden in the shadows of history, that help us understand the full scope of the Cangaço's impact on Brazil. The reign of terror that the Cangaceiros imposed on Brazil's northeast didn't end with their deaths. The legacy of the Cangaço, defined by its violence, fear, and psychological manipulation, left deep scars on the landscape physically, socially, and culturally. As the Cangaceiros were hunted down and eventually defeated, their impact on Brazil was far from over. The country, and especially the people of the Northeast, were forced to cope with the aftermath of the Cangaço for decades, as the brutal tactics and the specter of fear that the bandits left behind continued to haunt the region long after the violence subsided. One of the most profound effects of the Cangaço was the cultural shift it triggered. The Cangaceiros weren't just criminals, they became symbols of resistance and rebellion in a land plagued by inequality, poverty, and political instability. While some viewed them as outlaws who fought for justice in a broken system, others saw them as ruthless bandits who terrorized and destroyed their own people. This dichotomy remains to this day, as the myth of the Cangaceiro continues to play a complex role in Brazilian culture, blurring the lines between heroism and villainy. The fear and trauma left in the wake of the Cangaço were felt not just by those who lived through it, but also by future generations. The memories of brutal raids, executions, and the ever-present terror of being caught in the crossfire became a permanent part of the collective consciousness. For many, The Cangaço served as a constant reminder of the fragile nature of security and the terrifying unpredictability of violence. Children heard the stories from their parents, and the elderly relived their horrors long after the bandits had been driven out. Economically, the Cangaço crippled entire regions. The constant fear of raids made agriculture nearly impossible in many parts of the Northeast. Villagers were forced to abandon their homes and livelihoods, while entire communities lived in hiding, dependent on the precarious safety offered by military garrisons or sympathetic allies. The bandits' attacks, along with the terror they spread, stunted the region's development, leaving it isolated and impoverished long after the end of the Cangacero era. The power vacuum left by the Cangaceiros also affected the political landscape, with the government's inability to control the Cangaceiros for so long. The region became a lawless frontier where local leaders and warlords often held more power than the state itself. In Semi-arid, the remnants of the Cangaço's influence continued to shape politics for years, as former outlaws turned into influential figures who played on the memories of their violent past to gain power. In the chaos left behind, new forms of corruption, violence, and inequality emerged as the social fabric of the region remained frayed and fragile. Despite the passage of time, the stories of the Cangaceiros have never been fully erased from Brazil's history. Their legacy lives on in literature, music, and film. And the romanticized image of the Cangaceiro, both as a fearless outlaw and a tragic hero, continues to captivate the imagination of many. But for those who lived through their reign of terror, the Cangaço represents something far more horrifying, a brutal reminder of how fear can shape societies and how, even in the face of overwhelming power, the human spirit can be broken. As we reflect on the aftermath of the Cangaço, we must ask ourselves, what lessons can we learn from this violent chapter of history? How can we understand the effects of such terror on individuals, communities, and nations? The Cangaceiros may have been defeated, but their impact on Brazil endures, a haunting echo of the brutality and fear that shaped the lives of the people of the Northeast. The Cangaceiros, with their brutal tactics and notorious raids, are a part of Brazilian history that can never be easily forgotten. As the years have passed, the way we view them has changed. What once was simply considered the lawlessness of bandits has transformed into a complex and multifaceted chapter in the nation's story. The question remains, were the Cangaceiros heroes fighting against an oppressive system, or were they just criminals driven by greed and bloodlust? Their legacy is one that still divides opinions even today. Over time, the Cangaceiros have become romanticized figures in Brazilian folklore, immortalized in music, literature, and film. Lampião, Maria Bonita, and Carisco have been elevated to mythical status, often depicted as defiant rebels challenging a corrupt system. In some stories, they are seen as symbols of resistance against a government that failed to protect the poor, the marginalized, and the disenfranchised. To many, the Cangaceiros are not just outlaws, they are legends who fought for freedom in a harsh and unforgiving world. But as much as the Cangaceiros have been romanticized, the truth of their actions cannot be ignored. Their brutality, the lives they destroyed, and the fear they instilled are all part of the same narrative. These were not the actions of noble warriors, but of individuals who used terror and violence as tools to achieve their ends. The Cangaceiros were not only ruthless bandits, they were symbols of a power struggle that transcended individual battles. They represented an ongoing clash between the oppressed and the oppressors, a fight for control over both land and identity. The modern understanding of the Cangaceiros, however, doesn't just rely on myth and romanticized narratives. Scholars and historians have dug deeper into their legacy, uncovering the harsh realities of life in the northeast of Brazil during the early 20th century. This wasn't just a struggle between outlaws and the state, was a reflection of the socioeconomic inequalities and injustices that existed in the region. The Cangaceiros, in many ways, were a product of that system, created by the circumstances they faced, They were not just criminals, they were a reaction to an unjust world, one that drove people to extreme measures in order to survive. As we look back on the history of the Cangaceiros, it becomes clear that their legacy is complicated, shaped by both their violence and the social structures that helped create them. Today, we view them not only as outlaws, but as symbols of resistance, even if their methods were brutal and their tactics cruel. The Cangaceiros remind us of the fragility of power, the ways in which fear and terror can be wielded as weapons, and how history is often written by those who survive, not by those who perished in the bloodshed. Their story serves as a reminder that history isn't just about the victors, but also about understanding the experiences of those who were forced into extreme actions by circumstances beyond their control. The Cangaceiros, despite their brutality, were part of a larger narrative of survival in a land where violence and inequality were the norm. Their actions were a reflection of the world they lived in, a world where justice was scarce and survival was the ultimate goal. If you've stayed with us until the end, you've now uncovered a darker side of Brazilian history. What do you think about the Cangaceiros' legacy? Were they heroes or just criminals? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know how their story has changed the way you view this period of history. And if you're not yet subscribed, hit that button. There's always more to uncover in the dark corners of history. Also, check out the next video that dives into another untold story of the past.